I'm Vicki Hogarth, and welcome to Southwest Magazine. I'm joined today by John Kelly, author of the book Meaningful Memories. Thank you so much, John, for being here today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to this, Vicki.
I should hold up the book right now for people at home to see. I know that a lot of people in their life think or aspire to write a memoir, but so few do it. You did. What inspired you to do this, to take on this project?
What inspired me to take the project on, Vicki, is first of all, as you can even see from the cover, I mean, I'm a Bay of Fundy boy. In other words, I was born and brought up in St. John. And like many people in the communities, and I've said this before, like in Charlotte County, St. John County, all the way from St. Martin's, down to St. Andrews, we've been very fortunate. I was very fortunate in growing up in a very active parish culture. In this case, it was an Irish Catholic parish, and for those of you that are familiar with St. John, and I'll just throw this out now, here's some news for you. Did you know that up until about 1965, the largest Irish per capita population in North America wasn't Boston or New York, it was St. John, New Brunswick. 53% of the population were either Irish or could trace their origin, to an Irish family. So that's part of it. And so that culture, of course, was very prevalent in St. John, as I was growing up. And so I had some wonderful learning experiences there. And of course, much of my memoir, and it kind of breaks down into two parts. I have these chapters. And the first part of the chapter is about what I would call what an aspect of parish life was like, and what I learned from growing up in an active community parish. And of course, back in the days when I was growing up in the 40s and 50s, we didn't really have the the social services and all these things we have today. And so what we all learned very much so, and this is so important, and particularly for younger people to appreciate, is that parish life wasn't just so much about religion. And the thing that kept us all together, I mean, obviously we believed in God, and I mean, we attended church and things of that sort. But parish life was all about how we as an active community learned to respect one another, to look out for one another, and to work with one another. And so I learned all of these lessons about how that came about, and the different experiences I had growing up through that. And so what I then found is when I left St. John, I was in St. John until for a period of time, but left St. John early in my career and had to start a new career, is that when I went to Toronto, I was very fortunate to move into this model active community called St. Lawrence Market in downtown Toronto. And if any of you have ever visited Toronto, it's this place that's talked about all over the place. And even in magazines sometimes, like The Economist or big magazines, you'll see them reference this magic place called St. Lawrence Market, which is the ideal for active community living in a large city. And so it was a mix of everybody. There were, I don't want to use the word like wealthy, but there were, we lived in a condo where people were, quite frankly, well off. But initially, along with that, on our same street, there was social housing, there was co-op housing, there were union developments. We had a Catholic school and then a Protestant school, just like it was when I was growing up in St. John, although there was much greater mixture. And so what I was able to do was to say, oh, look, I can see how all of these things can also work for me as an adult, living in, if you want to call it like a modern, like upscale urban environment. And so I became very active in a number of things in Toronto while I was living there and going through that. And then, I guess if you want to carry this one step further, I was very fortunate. I had a career as a law professor in Toronto at Seneca College. Seneca College has more students than we have a population in Charlotte County. There are about 50,000 students. It's a big operation. But I retired, and then my wife and I, because we were active RVers, which I'll talk a bit about perhaps as we go along, we then decided to become snowbirds, and we were snowbirds for about 10 years up until COVID, and then of course things changed. But what we did is we didn't just drive around, we then decided to locate ourselves in active what are called RV resorts in both Florida and Arizona. And so you realize when you move into these resorts, they're like little communities. These aren't places you just stay overnight. These are places you stay for 5 months at a time. So you get there, and so all of a sudden you say, well, what are we going to do? And then basically somebody says, well, let's organize this. And so one of the resorts I was at, I said, okay, I'd love to do this. I was brought up as a bowler. Like I used to bowl, you know, candlepin bowling as a kid. They don't have it down there. So I said, what am I going to do? I said, well, what the heck? I said, bocce is just like candlepin bowling. You hold the ball in your hand and you roll it down a lane, a grass lane. I said, well, so I pioneered the building of a wonderful bocce court. To see where I'm coming from, because these are things that I had learned how to do growing up in an active community, in this case in St. John and also in Toronto. And so several years later, when we moved to, decided to relocate to Arizona, which was a wonderful experience as well, that was an active RV resort. And so they were trying to figure out, and Arizona, by the way, is what's called the hiker's heaven. I mean, there are these beautiful hikes you take through the mountains. And so this is great, but sometimes for people that are over 65 and 70, you can't necessarily hike up the mountain and back down. So I said, well, wait a minute. Let's set up a really special, like 55 plus hiking club. So I did that. Now, and it was very successful too. I'm saying that not because I want to say that I'm very successful at everything I do, but where I'm coming from is I can take all those things back to and so my memoir is about how I was learning all of these things and how to be active and how to contribute to your community and how to be an active person in your community. And so that was where I was. And so then, and I used to tell all these stories. And now for those of you who are from this area, particularly from the traditional towns like St. John, and St. George, places like this, when I was a law professor, did a lot of consulting and traveling. And I would go to a place like Vancouver, where supposedly people that I knew said, I'm going to go to Vancouver, and this is the new life, the new age, and I'm going to live in this place in Vancouver. So I would be there, and it's a beautiful city, by the way. I'm not running it down. So then I would go over to their house to visit. And we'll say they'd be married, their wife would be, I'm just saying, from Vancouver. And you could see the wife almost saying, oh my God, here we go again. Because you know what everybody wanted to talk about? John, do you remember when we were in St. John when we did this? And you remember that character? And you remember this store we used to shop? To see where I'm coming from, that's very powerful. And people remembered that. And there's been many books written about this. And probably, in fact, perhaps sometime down the road, if people would like to pursue it, I'd be happy to share all these things with them. And one of the best-selling books is called Return. And Return is about how people that were brought, this is all over the world, by the way, Return, and it deals with people that were brought up. For example, here's a good one for many of you who, if you don't live in Toronto, you've been there, and you obviously are aware of how many people in Toronto are Jamaican. There's a huge Jamaican community in Toronto of a couple of 100,000 people. Now, I knew this because as a law professor, I taught all of these people. Almost every Jamaican, if you stop and talk to them, do you know what you're going to find out if they're from Jamaica or Barbados? They have all still maintained this little family home back in Jamaica and Barbados. And they'll talk to you and they would say, Professor Kelly, my parents have this place back there and they're going to move there. They're going to go back. They really want to go back to Jamaica someday, even though obviously Jamaica doesn't have the quality of life materially that you might think we would have in Toronto and this and that. And so where I'm coming from is that when that's there with you, those memories will always be there, and you'll always feel that, in a way, maybe some people don't do this, but that they would love to come back home and do these. And so I decided that I'm going to write about this. So I'm going to take these model lessons, meaningful memories, and show people what it's like and what it was like to grow up in a powerful, sort of active community environment like this, and how this enabled me, when I use the word succeed, I don't want to just talk about make all kinds of money, but to basically end up having a successful life. It also enabled me to cope with failure. Not everything I did. I told you that I built a nice bocce court. There were some things I did that I wasn't successful with, but I had experienced what is called failing when I was younger, growing up. And fails are first attempts in learning. And I had all these fails, first attempts in learning as I grew up. And so I recognized that if you don't succeed, the old slogan, try again, or something like that. And so I said, okay, I'm going to basically show people how they can do this, and particularly because we're now an aging society, and New Brunswick, of course, is one of the most aged communities of all provinces, the populations of all across the country. I said, I'm going to write this about how even after the magic area 55, but how even after 55, you basically can still live a very active life. Okay, and that's what my sub-theme of the book is, of course, living life to the fullest. And so there. Okay, now and for those of you who are listening, I warned Vicki about this prior to the interview starting. I said, now Vicki, I said, was a law professor.
I love it.
And I said, what happens with law professors when you stop? I said, usually I'm all set to go for 55 minutes. In other words, that's
making my job easy, but you know what?
We're going to stop right there. So I've sort of
pick up on what you just said there, John, which is FAIL, which is an acronym you use a lot in the book, and you have a nice way of putting what FAIL stands for, first attempt in learning.
Yeah.
Why do you choose to see, and what made you choose failing in this way? I know we've all been taught to sort of sometimes feel shame over a failure, but you've looked at it in a very positive way, and how has that sort of affected your life?
Let me just give you a couple of examples, and these are people that have done maybe a bit better than I have, but examples of that. No, people are always, and I used to tell this to my students sometimes, I would give them these examples, and I said, now, how many people, this was when he was alive, how many people here know of this man called Steve Jobs? Oh, Steve Jobs, he found an Apple computer. I said, did you know that Steve Jobs was, 1, thrown out of college because he was so unsuccessful, 2, was fired initially from Apple because he screwed so many things up according to Apple. But I said, Steve Jobs basically didn't go home and sit in his room and cry. He said, wait a minute, what have these failures taught me? Like, in other words, what did I learn about, like, maybe how I shouldn't have done this, and then maybe what should I do? And of course, how many people today own what's called an iPhone? Well, as Steve Jobs was sitting home alone in his room, he said, wait a minute. He said, we can take this thing that used to be a cell phone and make it, into this incredible iPhone. So just where I'm coming from, that's an example of fail. There's another guy who made even more money, or was better than, not better, was more successful. And this man's name, he's a bit older now, he's my age now, his name is called Bill Gates. And a lot of people don't know that Bill Gates basically was kind of half kicked out and left Harvard after a year and came home and was working in his parents' basement, trying to figure out how to eventually invent Microsoft. So I'm giving you obviously extreme examples, but I'm just showing you how, as an academic, I'm a reader as well. And when you read all these stories, then you sort of see how most people that are successful in life, the stars that we read about, have had these failures. In other words, they're successful by their second and third time, that they try something. And now you people here, and I'll just mention this because Vicki, of course, as you all know, and I enjoy listening to her, but is an experienced media person, an experienced journalist. And there was a man in Toronto, this is 100 years ago now, and his name was Roy Thompson. And if you go to Toronto, you'll see this big hall called Roy Thompson Hall. Roy Thompson went bankrupt 3 times. And he couldn't get a job in Toronto because everybody said, oh, that's that Roy. He's going to screw up if we hire him, so we're not going to hire Roy. And so somebody said to Roy, well, listen, Roy, what I'll do for you, this thing is called radios have come out now. Like in those days it was a new thing about, I'm just saying 1920 or whatever it was. And so Roy Thompson, they said, we'll give you the franchise for a place called Timmins, Ontario, which was a growing mining community. So Roy shows up in Timmins, got off the train with a suitcase, or I guess a trunk full of radios. And all of a sudden he realized, oh, they got me again, because there was no radio station in Timmins. So Roy said, well, what can I do? And Roy said, well, I think I'll start a radio station. And he had a young boy with him at that time whose name was Ken Thompson. And so Roy said, we're going to start this radio station. And he said, you can be in charge of the music, Ken. And he said, up here, people, not like Roy Thompson Hall, they don't want to listen to classical music. They all listen to country and Western music. So Ken Thompson, as a teenager, he tells this story, obviously was a country music DJ as a teenager. Now, the reason I'm telling you that story is because, of course, there is a company now, and that's called Thomson Reuters. It's one of the most powerful companies in the world. And for those of you who have ever just even driven through Toronto, you will see Thomson Reuters owns the Globe and Mail, they own this, they own that, and they're, an extremely powerful, wealthy family. And so, again, going back to where we start from, those are examples that too many of us know. And again, my aspiration of going to Toronto wasn't to become a billionaire, but where I'm coming from is that those are the kind of things that inspired me as a person going through life to sort of recognize that that out of every crisis is an opportunity, and try and figure out where the opportunity portion of what that crisis is. So that's.
I agree with you. Oh, I totally agree with you on that. I think that sometimes our successes are what make our biography, but our failures are often what build our character and really create who we are. You also talk about a lot of life moments in the book that might seem small or insignificant, but in retrospect were very pivotal in who you became as a person.
Sure.
What were some of the more challenging chapters to write, or things that you knew you needed to include, even though maybe at first they didn't seem all that important?
Well, actually, I'll go back to this. Okay, here's a little local one. This goes back to when I was, I'd say, a young boy. And, like many kids in those days, when I used the term needed money, I mean, we had money for food and clothing, but, if you wanted spending money, you had to sort of figure out what to do. So I got this newspaper route and was selling newspapers door to door along Douglas Avenue. And so that wasn't like something that I thought, well, I'd start at. And so one day, as I was walking along, and if you know St. John, New Brunswick, Douglas Avenue, there are these mansions on Douglas Avenue. No, I did not live in one of the mansions. We had a nice little house, but I did not live in a mansion. So one of the doors I knocked on was this man called Mr. Monroe. C.A. Monroe, and I said, "Oh, hi, how are you?" And he said he used to always have his maid and daughters answer the door, but one time he just answered the door, and he said, "Who are you?" And I told him, and he said, "I'm Mr. C.A. Monroe." And I said, "Oh, hello." And he said, "Yeah." He said, "See this paper you're carrying?" He said, "Well, that was my company." Oh, I said, "Really?" And he said, "This magazine and that magazine?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, those are all my magazines." He said, "I became a major distributor for all these." He said, "Wow, look at that." And then he said to me, he said, "My real passion in life," and this is one of the first times a guy explained what passion meant, he said, "was never to be in the newspaper magazine business." He said, "Really?" So here I am as a 13-year-old boy or something, listening to this man tell me this story. And he said, "My passion in life was always gardening." And he said, "I always wanted to be a gardener." And so he said, something happened. And he said, "Now, you know who Casey Irving is, don't you?" And I said, "Oh, yes, we all know who Mr. Casey Irving is." And he said, "Well, he came along and said, could I buy your magazines?" And I said, "Well, sure you can." And he said, "Because," he said, "I had the opportunity to do what I really wanted to do." And for those of you who are old enough to remember this, beside what then was St. John Vocational School, which is now Harborview School, there was this large home with this magnificent gardens and its own private greenhouse and everything else. And that was Mr. C.A. Monroe's dream. And then he told me, he said, "This is where I started, just where you are today. But," he said, "look where I am and how I'm doing what I love." And he said, "You can do that too." He said, "I just want you to remember, always work hard and do this." So there's, what I'm just saying is a very small experience. Now, it wasn't actually a fail. I mean, it was an experience. But I learned from that. And then I would say learn, not that I went home and memorized it every night and started writing down, I am going to sort of start a newspaper company. But I know intrinsically as I grew up, like I can remember things like that. And this person telling me those lessons. And I'd said, if I, work hard and never give up, so to speak, then eventually things will work out for me. Now, there's an example of when I was a kid, so to speak, of the kind of thing that happened.
And so you've taken that to coming to St. Andrews where you live, but also RVing around North America. So you are following your dreams. Can you talk a little bit about how you've applied that to your own life?
Yeah, well, for sure. So, for example, my wife and I lived in downtown Toronto in a condominium, and St. Lawrence Market is a wonderful place to live. It's right down on the waterfront. But there's no backyard to park your trailer in. None of these things are in downtown Toronto. But we realized very early on that we also wanted to experience leisure-like life and go to parks, like provincial parks and places like this for the weekend. So we said, well, how can we do this? Well, we can't go, but we can't buy a trailer right now. So what we did, and we couldn't afford 2 vehicles. We couldn't, we were, as young people, we had a mortgage and we were paying things off. We could only afford one thing. So we said, oh, wait a minute. What, instead of buying a car and an RV, we can't buy 2, what if we just bought a VW pop-up van? We can park it on the street, and then we can just jump out the front door of our condominium every Friday afternoon and, drive down to a provincial park or, down to Niagara on the Lake or, wherever you might want to drive to. And I said, have a nice weekend. And then also we can drive back home to New Brunswick, in our little VW van, and we can always just stop in the night. And so, ironically, even though we were living in Toronto, for those of you who do RVing in New Brunswick, I did a lot of RVing in New Brunswick, like the Belle Isle Bay and all these places, where they had all these campgrounds. We would stay at all these spots. And so that's an example of how you get started. Now, and so there's a little lesson in this as well for anything you do. And sometimes people try and go too big. But I'll use the RV as an example. Okay, the way to get into RVing is not basically to look at how many feet you can see, but what is the best fit for you. So what we didn't do was buy, I'm saying, a 35-foot trailer and then say, gee, what are we going to do with this? No, we said we want to basically have weekends and do camping and all of this stuff. So there's the best fit for us. And so that's the way. Now, let's bring this back to everyday life for so many people. When I was living in Toronto, we bought this condo, and like many people, you can read about this in the news, how prices started to go up. They've boomed, and so it's no secret. When we eventually sold our condo, the people had to pay as much for the down deposit, the down payment, as we'd pay for the entire condo, years before. So, and you can read about that in the news every night, in the newspapers every day. But my wife and I didn't sell this condo, and people kept saying, "Oh, John, you can make money now. Now you can move to the suburbs, and you can buy like this home, buy this 3-bedroom home in, you can drive by Toronto and see all these suburban levels." So we said, no, we don't want to do that, because we would go visit these people, and guess what? They had this big home, but they couldn't afford to furnish it. Do you see what I mean? In other words, because they had got themselves tied up with this big mortgage, and they were worried every month, oh my God, what happens if interest rates go up? How are we going to pay for this? No, I'm not, obviously we had to watch our finances too, but we always avoided doing situations so that. So by way of analogy, so what you look at is, what is the best fit for me in my life at this particular point in time? What's the best fit for me as a career? What's the best fit for me, in terms of like a community that I want to live in? What's the best fit for me, in relationships that I want to be involved in? And so if you start using that approach, then, again, not that life is perfect, but you'd be surprised at how things can really start to work out for you.
Mm-hmm. It's shocking that we are almost out of time, but I feel like we need to do a part 2, because there's a lot of history in this book too that we haven't even touched on.
Okay.
So if you would be willing to come back again soon, I'd love to have you back. But in the meantime, what I'd like to do is tell viewers at home, first of all, where can they get Meaningful Memories if they'd like to follow along? Maybe we can make this a little bit of a series. And next time, I'd love you to talk about Partridge Island and a lot of the St. John history that we didn't touch on today.
Just while we're finished, because, come on back next time, because I'm going to tell you some things, and Vicki knows this because we talked about it before the show. Did you know, and I'm going to tell you all about this, that the famous Ellis Island in New York is modeled after Partridge Island in St. John, New Brunswick? Did you know that the first Carnegie endowed public library in Canada was St. John, New Brunswick, and it still exists there today, the building? And I can go on and on, did you know, but when you start telling all these things, that people say, wow, what a community. And I'll just leave you with one more before we finish, and that is, did you know that the Douglas Avenue Museum, the New Brunswick Museum, which is now closed down, when it was built, became the model for every museum across the country. We have that to our credit.
Wow.
So those are things that I'll talk about by way of historical development. So yeah, now, if you want to get the book, it's available for sale at Indigo. Just go to Indigo and the book is there on the shelf, and certainly I'd like you to get the book. You know, obviously everyone likes people to get the book that they've written, but there's other ways you can get the book. One, you can go to my website and just write this down on a piece of paper. Just go to www.johngkelly.ca. It will take you into my website. You get a nice little overview of the book, and you can also then order the book directly there, you know, just online, and it will then be delivered to you through Freeze and Press. And use Freeze and Press because you get a discount if you go through Freeze and Press, which is my publisher. But obviously, if you want to do Amazon, you can do that as well, or whatever. So that's one way you can get it. The next way that you can get it, and I'm saying this to everybody that's out there, I'd love to come to your community and do readings. And so if you were part of a parish group or a library or a community group, and you'd like to book me to come to your do a reading from a chapter, get hold of me, and certainly I'd love to do that for you. And here's the thing that would happen is I would bring the books with me. You can then get an autographed copy of this book from me if I'm there in person. But more importantly, we would set something up that I would give a portion of the sale of every book to your preferred charity or sort of social thing that you would like me to contribute to in your community. So we'd be doing something for the community at the same time, as well as having an enjoyable afternoon or whatever the case might be. All right, Vicki, is that
perfect? Well, and I think if anyone's listened to this interview, they know how important community is to you and who you've become. So I look forward to talking next time, though, more about history. So
okay, now as a closing thing, but then how do they get hold of this guy? All right.
John G. Kelly.
.ca. But then you can also send me an email, which is a lot easier. Just John, JOHN, at active retirement, one word, activeretirement.ca. So there's a clue. So it's not John go to sleep.ca. It's John at activeretirement.ca. So we'll have an active time if we get together.
My guest today has been John Kelly, author of Meaningful Memories. I'm Vicki Hogarth. Thank you for watching Southwest Magazine.
Southwest Magazine is a news and public affairs production of CHCO Television.